Hi, my name is Deborah Black. I'm a Master Gardener Volunteer with the UF-IFAS Pinellas County Extension Service, and I wanted to talk to you about vermicomposting. I think it's a really valuable product to have because most of us are dealing with very sandy soil in Florida that is nutrient poor, and compost will add to the nutrient density of the soil, and you can also use it as a great potting medium when you're potting things up. So I'm going to talk to you about the different kinds of containers that you can use. Some you can actually build your own, and the different products that you would use in your worm bin, how to feed your worms, how often to feed them. And so stay tuned, and we're going to dig more into worm compost. So what I'm going to teach you to do is how to set up your worm bin. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that your worm bin is always in a shady spot. Worms do not do well with being exposed to the sun. You also want to make sure that you have your worm bin sitting up so that it never becomes waterlogged, because if it becomes waterlogged, the worms will drown. So if you do choose to make your own worm bin, you want to make sure that there's adequate drainage in your worm bin. And you can use various types of material. I'll go into that later on. As far as setting up your worm bin, you want to use coconut coir, which is a product in that bag over there. It's ground up coconut, and it's a great source of bedding for worms. I tend not to use paper just because it becomes like paper mache when it starts getting wet, which is inevitable. And so what you would do is you would have the bottom layer. If you get a worm composting system, it usually comes 2 or 3 trays. So your bottom tray is going to be the one where the worms live. It's called the processing tray. And that's where you put food in each corner, about a handful of food. And I'll go into more detail about what kind of food you should give them. So you're going to put food in the corner, then you put a layer of the coconut coir, and then you'll have your actual worms, which are red wigglers. Eisenia foetida is the botanical name. A lot of people get them confused with earthworms, but they're not earthworms. They're 2 very different kinds of worms. Earthworms are very valuable in terms of aerating the soil, but the red wigglers are going to produce the actual fertilizer that you want to use. And then you would have a layer of leaves. You want to make sure you never use magnolia or bay leaves, because the oils will harm your worms. Generally, I have 4 worm bins, and it takes me about an hour and a half each week from start to finish to cut up their food. And the kinds of food you want to give them are vegetable scraps. For example, a salad that's gone bad with no dressing though. Anything that's sort of going bad, you can give them. Don't give them any citrus, no meat, no fish, no dairy, and nothing with oil. And again, nothing with bay leaves or magnolia leaves. And so what you'll do is I feed them once a week, and generally I find that by the end of the week they're ready for more food. The one thing you don't want to do is you don't overfeed them. I know it's tempting, you're going on vacation, your pet sitter's there, you don't want to give your pet sitter extra duties, so you decide that you're going to give them extra food. Don't do that. It's better to underfeed them, because eventually what's going to happen is you're going to get sort of an ammonia type of smell. When your worm bin starts smelling bad, it's usually because there's too much nitrogen, too many greens. And what you could do is you could add either leaves, or you could add used coffee grounds. And if you go to coffee shops, a lot of coffee shops will give you the used coffee grounds, and you would just mix it into their food. One of the mistakes I made was I cut up a watermelon, and I gave the watermelon scraps to the worms, and the bin smelled awful because it was just too much liquid when it broke down. So you want to make sure that you don't, there's no sort of smell. Eventually, the finished product from this to this is going to have a really nice earthy smell. It's not going to have an unpleasant smell. A lot of people confuse the liquid that comes out of your worm bin, which is called leachate, with worm compost too. They're 2 very different things, even though they might look the same. The worm leachate has a lot of pathogens in it, and it's okay to use as a drench around your fruit trees, but I would not spray it on edibles. And so you want to make sure that you're going to use worm compost tea around your edibles, especially if you decide to use it as a foliar spray. For example, if you're going to spray your tomato plants or your peppers. So what I wanted to talk about was the practicalities of maintaining your worm bin. As I discussed before, I would put one handful of food in each corner, and making sure that you don't use any citrus, oils, dairy, meat, fish, chicken. I would keep that out of your worm bin. And also just making sure that there's a balance between the nitrogen and the carbon in your bin. And you'll know that it's out of balance when it's an unpleasant smell. So I wanted to talk to you about the how to make worm compost tea. It's very easy to make. I usually make it overnight. And so what you would need basically is you would need a bucket. You would need a paint strainer that you can get at any hardware store. And you need either a bungee cord to tie it. And then what you would do is you would first put, the order in which you would do this is you would put, these are called airstone bubblers. And this is airline tubing. You attach this to your aquarium pump. And this is a pump that is ready for a 10-gallon aquarium. You could buy it online or you could buy it at a pet store. And you want to make sure that this is always above your bucket because you don't want the fluid going back into your pump. So this sits up here and this sits below. And then what I would do is I would add about 5 tablespoons of unsulfured molasses. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a really good microbial environment for the worm compost tea. And then what you would do is you would fill this up with water, and then you would have your about 5 good-sized handfuls or 5 hand trowels of your actual worm compost which you get from your worm bin. And you put that in this paint strainer and you would tie it around the bucket, and then you would fill the bucket with water. And what you would do is you would turn this on, and you would, it's debate about whether you want to put it on for 4 hours, 8 hours. I usually put it on for 8 hours just to have it go overnight. And then what you do is the next morning you take the liquid. It's going to look sort of like a brown liquid. It's going to have a slightly molasses smell to it. And what you would do is you would mix it with your, for example, if you decide to water your fruit trees or whatever trees you're doing, you want to make sure that you use 1 part of the worm tea to 10 parts of water. It's very, very potent. I know a lot of us are tempted, you know, more is better, but in this case really less is more because it's a very potent fertilizer. It won't burn your roots, but it's probably better to use less than more. And what you would use that as a drench, or you could, if you're potting things up and you decide to water, you could use that. I typically fertilize my citrus trees once a month with the worm compost. I fertilize citrus from February through October, and I find that thus far my citrus trees are pretty healthy. And so that's how you make your worm compost tea. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your worm bin itself. So you've decided you've located a spot that's going to be in shade all day, and you set it up. You can use a milk crate and you set up your worm bin. I got this online. It's called a worm cycler, and it comes with 3 trays. And you put it together. It's very easy to put together. They give you all the equipment, washers and everything else. And so you put this together. The bottom is going to be the tray in which all of the liquid falls down. And so your worms are never submerged in water. This is your processing tray. And then over time, what is going to happen is that your worms are going to multiply and you're going to get a tremendous amount of worm compost. And that's when you want to harvest your worm compost. So there's one of 2 ways you could do it. You could put your worm compost in the sieve. And what you would do is you would sort out the worms from the compost. You put the worms back in your bin. And then you would take the worm compost and you could use it either as a potting medium or as a fertilizer. Again, you want to use 1 part worm compost to 10 parts of, let's say for example, potting soil or your coconut coir. And then what you would do is you would put your empty tray on top, because what you want to do is you want the worms to climb up. So the way you would set this up is when you first get your worm compost bin, what you're going to do is you're going to line it with newspaper, about 5 sheets of newspaper, and then you're going to put your food in the corners, and you're going to put your coconut coir in, and then you're going to put your worms in the very bottom. With this, it's the same process, except what's really important is you don't want to use newspaper because it's going to make it very difficult for the worms to climb up. And so what you want to do is you want to set this down, put your coconut coir food in the corner, and you stop putting food in the tray in which the worms currently are, what we call the processing tray. Because what's going to happen is that the worms are going to sense that the food is in another tray and they'll start climbing up. But if there's newspaper, it's going to block their ability to climb up. And then what you could do is, it'll be a process of several months. When the worms climb up into this tray, you can take all of the compost in this tray and use it. You can store it in a bucket, or you can store it or use it immediately. But it's a really, as I say, it's a really great resource to have on hand. So if you decide you're going to spend the day potting things up, you have your worm compost right there. The other thing that I do is, just because of where I live, we have a lot of critters coming through, and so what I do is I put 2 bricks on the lid of my worm compost so that the critters can't get in. And now I want to talk to you about how to make your own worm compost bin. You could take 2 sterilite containers. You don't want them to be more than about 10 gallons because they get very, very heavy. Once the worms are in there, there's compost and moisture. So you take your 2 sterilite containers. You want them to be opaque. You don't want them to be black because that's going to be too hot. You want them to be a dark blue. The reason why you don't want them to be transparent is because even though the worms are blind, they're very sensitive to light, which is why they tend to go to the bottom of the bin. And so you take your 2 containers, and what you would do is you would drill holes with a 1/4 of an inch drill bit in the very bottom sterilite container. And then you would drill holes in the top of the container, 1/16 of an inch drill bit in the top of the container. And then what you would do is you would take 4 terracotta pots and you would put them upside down so the lip of the pot is down on the sterilite container. And then you set your sterilite container on top of that. The reason why you don't want to put them directly, the sterilite containers directly on each other, is because they're eventually going to stick together. It's going to be very hard to pry them apart. So you take your terracotta pots, whatever size, and then you take your second sterilite container and you do the same thing. You drill your holes, 1/4 of an inch bit at the bottom, 1/16 of an inch bit on the top, and you would set that on top of the terracotta pots. And then what you would do is you would do the same process as this, where you would take you would bury the food in the corner, and you would take your layer of coconut coir and then put your worms on top of that, and then you could do a layer of dead leaves, or you could do a layer of cardboard. If you do use cardboard, try not to use the corrugated cardboard that has glue in it. The other thing, that if you tend to use tea bags, worms love tea bags, but make sure you take the staple out just so they're not cutting themselves on it. So in closing, I'd like to leave you with some takeaway points. Your bin should always be in the shade. You want to make sure that your bin is sitting up so that it is, the worms are never submerged. And when you feed your worms, try to feed them not too much, and never citrus, oils, chicken, fish, or meat. And also, if you order them online, they will come to you. They'll be very skinny. You might think that they're dead, but they're not. They'll come back. I would say that if you can find somebody local from whom to get your worms, that's much better, because they already have been acclimated and you would just have to add them to your bin. If you have any questions, please contact gardenhelp@pinellascounty.org. Thank you for joining us.